dared to defy the global order. It was supposed to be the end of his story, the moment he was dragged from power and forgotten. But instead, something unexpected happened. The warrant backfired instantly. Streets across Africa erupted in defiance. Hashtags spread like wildfire. And what was meant to isolate Traoré only turned him into a symbol of unshakable resistance. Drop your city name in the comments right now, because this story is bigger than borders, and it's only just beginning. Ibrahim Traoré was never supposed to be the man who shook the balance of global politics. Born far from the polished conference halls of Europe or America, his story began in the dusty heart of Burkina Faso, a nation small in size but massive in resilience. He was a soldier first, a leader only later. But even as a young man, his convictions burned brighter than the weapons he carried. The son of farmers, he grew up watching his people toil endlessly in fields that produced little wealth for them, yet enormous profit for foreign corporations. He saw firsthand how the nation's resources, gold, cotton, and land, were shipped out to enrich others, leaving his people with poverty and despair. By the time he rose within the ranks of the army, Burkina Faso was already bleeding. The country was battered by terrorism, manipulated by foreign interests, and haunted by the legacy of colonial exploitation. Corruption ate away at what little hope remained, while young people dreamed of escape rather than building futures at home. To many, it felt like Burkina Faso was being strangled, its sovereignty a word on paper, not a lived reality. Traoré's rise came not from politics as usual, but from the raw hunger of a population desperate for dignity. When he stepped forward, taking leadership, and as Traoré began building new alliances, speaking out against neo-colonial exploitation, and reclaiming resources once looted by outsiders, the whispers started. He had become too bold, too loud, too symbolic. That is when Interpol's warrant emerged, not as a sudden act of justice, but as the inevitable strike against a man who refused to kneel. What the warrant claimed mattered less than what it represented. To the powerful, it was a tool to isolate Traoré, to cut him off from allies, to paint him as a fugitive. But to the people, it felt like déjà vu, a reminder of every time a leader who dared to fight for Africa's dignity was silenced. And this time they were ready. Across Burkina Faso, murals appeared overnight, painted in bright reds and greens, showing Traoré's face framed not as a criminal, but as a liberator. In marketplaces, in universities, in mosques and churches, the conversations carried a single thread. If the world feared Traoré, maybe he was exactly the leader Africa needed. The warrant had set a stage far bigger than Interpol realized. It was not just about one man. It was about centuries of struggle, exploitation, and resistance converging in a single name. And as the warrant spread across global headlines, the countdown to backlash had already begun. When the announcement came, it did not arrive with the sound of soldiers' boots or sirens in the night. Instead, it appeared on television scrolls, in breaking news alerts, and whispered phone calls that spread across Ouagadougou like wildfire. Interpol has declared Traoré a wanted man. For some, it was shocking. For others, it was expected. But for the young men and women of Burkina Faso, the generation that had grown tired of watching leaders bow to foreign masters, it was a call to arms, though not in the form of guns, but in the form of voices. Within hours, posters appeared in the capital, not posters printed by officials, but hand-drawn ones painted with brushes dipped in defiance. Traoré's face appeared on walls and street corners, no longer just the image of a president, but the symbol of something greater, an Africa refusing to kneel. Students abandoned lectures to gather in squares, their chants rising above the blaring horns of taxis and motorcycles. Women formed circles in markets, their voices sharp, reciting prayers not for survival but for victory. Farmers from nearby villages poured into the city, carrying placards written on scraps of cardboard, declaring that Traoré was not a fugitive but their son, their brother, their hope. Across social media, the backlash grew even louder. Hashtags like "Gun Hands Off Traoré" and "Allow Africa Unchained" began to trend, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa and even in the diaspora. From Lagos to Johannesburg, from Dakar to Nairobi, young Africans flooded timelines with images of solidarity, long tied to foreign interests. sat in uneasy silence, afraid that defending Traoré might put their own seats at risk. Others, quietly inspired by the courage of Burkina Faso, began to whisper their support. A few even saw an opportunity. If the people of Africa were ready to rally behind Traoré, maybe it was time to shift alliances, to break from the invisible chains that had bound them for decades. In Pan-African forums, debates grew heated. Was Traoré reckless, or was he the spark Africa had been waiting for? Meanwhile, the global powers behind the warrant underestimated the emotional fire they had lit. Editorials in Western papers painted Traoré as a threat to stability, a dangerous nationalist pushing Africa toward chaos. But the more they wrote, the more their words backfired. Each article only fueled the anger, reminding Africans of how the same narratives had once been used to bury their heroes. The warrant had not broken Traoré's reputation, it had sanctified it. In Ouagadougou, nights turned electric. Candlelight vigils stretched for miles, glowing like rivers of fire through the city streets. Entire families came together in unity, chanting under the stars, their voices echoing with the memory of Sankara, Lumumba, and all those who had fallen before. Young artists painted the walls with defiant art, graffiti declaring that if Traoré was wanted by Interpol, then so too were the millions who stood with him. Drummers filled the air with rhythms of resistance, each beat carrying the message louder than any broadcast. Africa will not kneel again, and the pressure kept building. The warrant had not weakened Traoré. It had given him something more powerful than protection. It had given him immortality in the hearts of his people. Every hour, every headline, every chant in the streets escalated the tension, pushing the story closer to its breaking point. By the 7th day after the warrant, it was no longer just about one man. It had become a movement. African students in Europe marched in solidarity. Diaspora communities in America and the Caribbean held rallies, holding up portraits of Traoré, alongside historical figures like Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela. What was supposed to be the end of Traoré's influence had only expanded his reach across oceans, and somewhere in the corridors of power, Interpol officials realized what had happened. Their warrant, designed to silence, had instead created a storm. The world was watching, Africa was rising, and the stakes were higher than ever. The stage was set for a dramatic clash, not in back rooms of diplomacy or secret chambers of courts, but in the hearts of millions who had decided that one man's fate was tied to their own. The tension reached its breaking point on a sweltering afternoon in Ouagadougou. The air carried the sound of thousands, students, farmers, mothers with children strapped to their backs, all converging on the city center. Flags of Burkina Faso waved alongside banners painted with bold words, "We are Traoré." The streets trembled beneath the footsteps of people who refused to be silenced. Then, news spread like lightning. Interpol envoys had arrived in the region. For many, it felt like an insult, as though foreign hands were reaching directly into the heart of their sovereignty. Rumors swirled. Would Traoré be seized? Would Burkina Faso's own security forces betray him under pressure? Nobody knew for certain. Thousands dropped to the ground in unison, creating a living carpet of resistance. Mothers held up their children, students raised their fists, and the silence that followed was deafening. In that silence, the world saw something undeniable. This was not the defiance of one man, but the defiance of a nation. Interpol officials, watching from secure convoys, understood instantly. There was no arresting Traoré without igniting an inferno. Every step they might take against him was now a step against millions. Cameras zoomed in on their tense faces, and the images went viral in minutes. Across social media, captions spread like wildfire. They came for one man. They found an entire nation. Meanwhile, African leaders who had hesitated until now began to shift. From Ghana to Tanzania, from South Africa to Senegal, statements of support poured in. Some were cautious, others bold, but all carried the same message. The arrest of an African leader by outside forces would not be tolerated. In Pan-African assemblies, voices rose demanding that Interpol retract the warrant. Diplomats who had once stayed silent now faced enormous pressure, their own people demanding they stand with Burkina Faso. And then came the ultimate blow. It already defeated the warrant. For the first time in decades, Africa's streets and Africa's leaders were aligned. The so-called international order had miscalculated. The warrant did not isolate Traoré. It had isolated Interpol itself. Instead of weakening him, it exposed the arrogance of those who believed Africa could still be controlled by foreign decrees. As night fell, the silence of earlier gave way to jubilation. Drums thundered, fireworks lit the sky, and chants shook the earth. What had begun as a legal notice had transformed into a revolution of spirit. The people had spoken, and their roar was louder than any warrant. Interpol retreated into the shadows, their mission stalled, their credibility shattered. Across the globe, commentators struggled to frame the story. Was this defiance? Was it chaos? Or was it something bigger, the rebirth of a continent refusing to bow? The climax was clear. The warrant meant to destroy Traoré had instead become the spark of a new African awakening. When the dust settled, one thing was undeniable. The warrant had failed. Not only had it failed, it had backfired so dramatically that its shadow stretched far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Interpol, once seen as an untouchable global authority, now found itself questioned in living rooms, newsrooms, and parliaments across the world. For millions of Africans, the episode revealed something powerful. Unity was their greatest defense. Across cities from Lagos to Nairobi, from Johannesburg to Bamako, murals of Traoré appeared almost overnight. His face, painted in vibrant colors, became less about one man and more about what he represented. A refusal to bend under pressure, a mirror for a continent that had too often been told its place in the world. Children walked past those murals on their way to school, whispering his name, carrying a seed of resistance that could not be erased. The global media scrambled to control the narrative. Western anchors framed the events as chaos, instability, or a dangerous populist wave. But their words rang hollow against the reality visible on every screen. Images of peaceful protest, of nations standing shoulder to shoulder, of a people refusing to be silenced. What they called instability looked, to millions, like empowerment. Governments that had once aligned unquestioningly with external powers began to pause. If the will of the people could ignite with such force in Burkina Faso, what might happen in their own nations if they ignored the calls for dignity, sovereignty, and justice? Diplomats who had once seen Traoré as a liability began to treat him as a voice they could not afford to ignore. The warrant, meant to cut him off, had instead given him a global megaphone. And yet, beneath the celebrations, there was an awareness. This was not the end of the struggle. The chains of exploitation, of racism, of foreign dominance had not vanished overnight. They lingered in contracts, in boardrooms, in the quiet policies that determined who benefited from Africa's wealth. But something had shifted. A wound had been exposed, and the bandages of silence could no longer cover it. In villages and cities alike, conversations deepened. Parents told their children that they were not powerless. Teachers reminded their students that the future was not written by others, but by their own hands. And everywhere, one question echoed. If a warrant meant to silence one man could awaken millions, what else could unity achieve? For Interpol, the humiliation was severe. Quietly, the warrant lost momentum, buried under technical excuses and procedural delays. But the damage had been done. Their authority no longer looked neutral. It looked political. And for a continent long scarred by such politics, the memory of this moment would not fade. Traoré himself became more than a leader. To some, he was flawed. To others, he was controversial. But to all who had lived through the moment, he was proof that resistance had power. Whether or not he remained in office for decades was beside the point. His defiance had written a new chapter, one where Africa was no longer simply reacting to the world but confronting it on its own terms. And now, the story turns to you, the viewer. This is not just a story about Burkina Faso or one leader. It is a story about dignity, about refusing to accept labels written by others. It is about asking yourself, what does it mean to stand when you're told to kneel? What does it mean to speak when silence is